3 years ago, Elias Thorne held a senior environmental engineering license, drove a silver sports car, and spent his weekends with his botanist wife Claire in a house that looked out over the valley. It was the kind of life that made sense. Now, at 42, he stood in a pair of cracked leather boots, holding a rough wooden shepherd crook, while 30 nervous boar goats grazed behind him at the edge of a blackberry thicket nobody else wanted. His bank account held exactly $47. Claire was gone. Corporate scandal had taken the license first, then the savings, then the reputation that used to open every door in the county. What was left had gone toward one more month of chemotherapy the insurance wouldn't cover. He sold the car for that month. The money ran out. 3 weeks later, so did she. He told himself he had nothing left to lose. That was supposed to be the worst part. For the third morning in a row, the herd held back from the thickest patch of bramble at the north end of the lot. Nothing strange about it. The thorn grew denser there than anywhere else on the property, and goats choose easy forage over hard forage every time there's a choice. This one didn't have a choice. She'd worked her way along the thin patches until the thin patches ran out, and the last stretch of tender growth sat on the far side of the thick wall. She pushed through it anyway. Her front leg went through the ground up to the knee, not into dirt, through something, a great rusted thin as paper in places that gave way under her weight and dropped her leg into open space beneath it. She thrashed. Each pull twisted the leg further between two bent iron bars instead of freeing it, the metal biting tighter the harder she fought. The scream reached Elias before he was even standing. He ran, dropped to his knees at the edge of the hole, and worked the leg loose bar by bar, bending what he could, snapping what he couldn't. It took both hands and most of a minute. When the leg came free, she bolted back to the herd and forgot the whole thing had happened. Elias stayed on his knees. He cleared more leaf litter off the grate to see how far it ran, in case another goat found the same hole. Underneath the rust, the iron was worked in a pattern, bars crossing at even intervals, hinges bolted at 2 corners built to let a section of it lift like a hatch. Nobody forged a hatch into open ground for no reason. He called the leasing office before he touched anything else, kept the question professional, the kind a contractor asks to cover himself before somebody blames him for a hole in a client's ground. The woman on the phone put him on hold for a long time. When she came back, her voice had changed, and she told him someone from the ownership group would need to come out and see it in person. He kept working while he waited. Copper tag, no bigger than a fingernail, came loose from the hinge dirt under his thumb. Green with age, one edge folded over, most of the stamped lettering worn past reading. What was left looked Latin. A genus name, maybe, or half of one. The kind of tag Claire used to wire to the base of anything she was tracking in the field, so she'd remember which seedling was which once spring came. He put it in his shirt pocket and kept digging. The hatch came free just past noon, packed with dirt so hard it might have sat there since before either of them were born. Underneath it, where he expected more dirt, there was nothing, a drop. Cool air rose out of the gap, carrying a smell he hadn't breathed since he stood in Claire's old university greenhouse, waiting for her to finish a late experiment. Wet stone, old growth, something that had been shut away from weather for longer than he could guess at. He shone his phone light down into it and found the curve of iron ribs disappearing into the dark, and past them glass, not clear, purple, catching the little light there was and throwing it back like something bruised. He was still crouched over the opening when the truck came down the access road too fast for the ruts in the gravel. Elias didn't need to turn around to know it wasn't the leasing office. He knew the sound of that engine, the particular way it downshifted before a stop. From 3 years and 1 lifetime ago, back when it used to idle outside a boardroom, he no longer had a badge to enter. Truck door opened. Boots hit gravel. Elias. Just the name. Called out before he'd even had the chance to stand up, which meant whoever it was had recognized him from the road, from the goats, from 100 yards out, before Elias had recognized anything at all. Closed his hand around the copper tag in his pocket and got to his feet. Turned around already knowing who he was going to see, and the knowing didn't make it easier. Victor Callahan stood at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his pockets and an expression that had gone still the second he'd seen what Elias was kneeling over. Not surprise. Recognition. The kind that came from already knowing exactly what was buried on this hillside and had simply never expected anyone to find the door. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Behind Victor, an excavator he'd brought sat idling at the gate, its engine ticking over, waiting on a word that hadn't come yet. Elias looked down at the hatch, at the purple glass curving away into the dark underneath his own 2 boots, at the shirt pocket where the copper tag still sat warm against his chest. Whatever this was, Victor already knew. Elias was going to find out too. Victor didn't answer right away. He looked past Elias at the open hatch, at the purple curve of glass just visible in the dark below it, and something moved behind his face that wasn't quite calculation and wasn't quite fear. He glanced back at the excavator idling at the gate. He didn't wave it forward. He asked, instead, how much Elias still owed on the goats, on the truck, on anything. Elias understood the question for what it was before Victor finished asking it. Not concern, an opening bid. A number was coming next, small enough to sound generous and large enough to make $47 look like nothing. And all it would cost was silence and walking away and letting the excavator finish what it came here to do. For half a second, Elias did the math anyway. He hated himself for it and did it anyway. A number like that would cover the truck payment. It would cover groceries through winter. It would cover a great many things that had been keeping him awake at 2 in the morning for longer than he wanted to admit. His hand found the copper tag in his shirt pocket without him deciding to reach for it. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to look at it to remember the way Claire used to talk about the people who paid to make inconvenient things disappear quietly, and the particular kind of contempt she reserved for anyone who let them. He said he wasn't selling anything he hadn't found yet. Victor's jaw worked once. He didn't repeat the offer. He said he'd have someone from the ownership group confirm the parcel records by the end of the week, turned and walked back to his truck without looking at the hatch again. The excavator's engine dropped to a low idle behind him as the pickup reversed out through the gate, gravel popping under the tires, and then the lot was quiet except for the goats and the wind moving through what was left of the Thorne. Elias stood there a long moment before he understood that Victor had just left without ordering the machine forward, and that a man holding every legal advantage in the world did not usually do that unless he had a reason to be careful. He went back to the hatch. Clearing took 3 days after that, not because the ground fought him, though it did, but because the herd still had a contract to finish. And Elias split his mornings between the 2 jobs like a man trying to keep 2 separate lives from touching. Goats in the far field until noon. The hatch after that, working with a trowel and a wire brush because anything heavier risked cracking whatever was under the dirt before he understood what it was. Iron came up in sheets of rust that flaked off under the brush and left his hands stained orange to the wrist. The soil packed around the frame gave up its grip one stubborn handful at a time. By the second day, the hatch had widened into a full section of collapsed roofline. Every joint had been made to outlast the person who made it. Then, halfway through the second afternoon, the trowel struck something that rang wrong. Not iron, higher, thinner. He stopped and worked the spot clear with 2 fingers. And what came up was a second grate, smaller than the first, bent inward from the inside instead of the outside. Something down there had tried to get out. He sat back on his heels with that thought for longer than he wanted to admit, then went back to work, because there was still a contract to finish and a hillside to clear and no answer waiting for him in the dirt that didn't require more digging first. On the third day, clearing the last stretch of roofline, his trowel caught on something that wasn't iron and wasn't glass, a second vent, sealed under its own flat stone. He worked the stone free and held the back of his hand near the gap instead of his face, the way he'd been trained to check a confined space before anyone made the mistake of breathing it in first. Cool air moved against his skin, steady, coming from somewhere that shouldn't still have air moving through it after however many years this had sat sealed under the ground. Something down there was still breathing. Something down there was still breathing, and Elias had no way to go find out what. Not alone. He knew that much from 3 years of site inspections before his license got taken, from every confined space protocol he used to sign off on for other men to follow. A sealed chamber that had held air long enough to still move air was not a place a person entered without someone standing at the opening, ready to pull a rope if the air turned on him halfway down. He had 30 goats, a truck with 190,000 miles on it, and no rope crew. What he had was a coil of nylon line in the truck bed and a fence post solid enough to anchor it to, and against every protocol he used to enforce on other men, he was tying it off himself when the voice behind him asked if he was planning to fall in there or just think about it until dark. He hadn't heard anyone come up the fence line. She was standing at the gap in the chain link, watching him loop the rope around the post with the specific disapproval of someone who recognized a bad idea when they saw one being built in real time. She asked who was going to be standing up here if the line went slack. He didn't have an answer for that. He'd stopped expecting one from anyone but himself 3 years ago. She climbed through the gap anyway and took the other end of the rope out of his hands before he could argue about it. Her name was Anna. She worked the garden plots on the other side of the fence 3 mornings a week, and she held the line the way someone holds a thing they intend to actually use. Both hands wrapped tight, boots braced against the collapsed edge of the roofline. He lowered himself into the gap. His boots found a shelf 4 feet down, iron, bolted into the chamber wall, wide enough to stand on but not wide enough to see past. Whatever the chamber actually held was further below that, past where the shelf's own shadow swallowed the flashlight beam. He leaned out over it, one hand still on the rope, his full weight committed to the line for the first time since he'd started down. The rope bit into his palm. Anna's grip held. He swept the light across what the beam could reach below the shelf. Glass curved away from him in every direction, purple and intact, holding back 100 years of collapsed dirt on the outside, while the inside stayed clear enough to see through. Rows of something below him, dark shapes he couldn't identify yet, arranged with a regularity that no collapse could explain. Whatever this space had been built to hold, it had been built to hold it in order, and the order had survived longer than the building above it had. The rope pulled taut. Anna's voice came down from the opening, flat and even, asking if he was still breathing down there. He told her he was. He didn't tell her that his hands had started shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold, and everything to do with the fact that the last time he'd stood somewhere this quiet and this deliberately built, Claire had been standing next to him, reading labels off a greenhouse bench that someone else had cared for with the exact same patience. Climbed back out because the light was failing, and the rope was cutting grooves into his palm that would still be there tomorrow. Anna helped haul him over the collapsed lip of the hatch, and for a moment they both sat on the edge of it, breathing hard, saying nothing. She was the one who finally spoke. She asked if he was going to tell anyone what was down there. He said he hadn't decided yet. She looked at the hole a while longer, then back at him, and said something that didn't fit the question he'd asked, the way a thought sometimes gets loose before a person means to let it go. I'm used to being the one who finds out last. She didn't explain it. She stood up, brushed the rust off her knees, and said she'd bring a second flashlight tomorrow if he was still digging. Elias sat at the edge of the hatch after she'd gone, looking down into the dark he hadn't finished exploring, and understood that whatever he'd just agreed to, it wasn't only about the glass. The beam found rows of glass below the shelf before it found anything else. Dozens of small domes, no bigger than a bread box each, lined up on iron shelving that ran the length of the chamber wall, every one of them sealed shut and fogged with a century of condensation on the inside. Whatever was growing in them, if anything still was, had been growing in the dark for longer than Elias had been alive. He climbed out with the flashlight battery dead and a phone full of blurry photographs. Anna helped him drag a sheet of tarp over the open hatch before she had to leave for the morning kindergarten shift, tying it down at the corners so nothing wandered in overnight, and told him she'd come back and check on it after school let out. By the next morning, the Historic Preservation Office had done the one thing he hadn't expected them to do quickly. They'd sent someone. Evelyn Sorensen climbed down into the hatch before Elias had finished explaining where to put her boots. She was younger than the voice on the phone had suggested, sharp-eyed, already reaching for the nearest pane of glass with a kind of care that told him she'd handled things this old before and had broken exactly none of them. She held a shard up to the light and turned it slowly between two fingers, the same unhurried way Claire used to turn a specimen slide before she'd trust herself to say what she was looking at. Elias hadn't expected that particular memory to surface standing in a hole in the ground with a stranger, and it cost him something to keep his face still while it did. She asked how long the color had been that deep. He said it was getting darker by the day. It hadn't been this dark the first morning he'd uncovered it, and it had deepened again just since yesterday, the way a bruise settles before it fades. She explained it without looking up from the shard, the way a person explains something they've said before to people who didn't ask the right follow-up questions. Glassmakers in the late 1800s used manganese dioxide to strip the natural green tint out of their batches, a cheap fix that worked well enough. Nobody thought twice about it at the time. What nobody accounted for was decades of steady ultraviolet exposure, turning that same manganese into something else entirely. A slow chemical drift toward violet that only showed up once the glass had spent 100 years or more in open sun, which meant, she said, setting the shard down with the same care she'd picked it up with, that whatever this was had been built before 1900 and had spent most of its life afterward buried, out of the sun, because otherwise it would have turned this color decades before anyone alive today was born. Elias asked how she knew all of that without blinking. She said it was the only interesting thing about her job most days. They spent the next hour cataloging what the beam had missed the night before. Iron shelving bolted directly into bedrock. A drainage channel cut into the floor with a precision that suggested a surveyor's hand, not a farmer's. Evelyn moved through it like she was reading a room built in a language. Only she still spoke fluently, narrating half of it out loud without seeming to notice she was doing it. And Elias found himself listening less for the information and more for the particular way she went. Quiet, whenever she found something she didn't have an immediate answer for. She went quiet like that at the drainage channel. She crouched over it a long time, tracing the cut stone with one finger, then asked if he'd pulled any county records on this parcel yet. He said he'd tried. The clerk's office had nothing filed under the current ownership group going back more than 8 years. Evelyn said that in itself was strange. A structure built with this much care almost always left a paper trail somewhere. A permit, a survey, a newspaper mention, something. She'd request the older county archive herself, the physical boxes nobody had digitized yet, and see what turned up. She was halfway up the ladder when she stopped and looked back down at him. She said the request might take longer than usual. She'd tried to pull records on a handful of older Cedar County parcels before, unrelated to this one, and more than once she'd hit a restriction flag on the file, an old request from a private party asking that certain boxes stay sealed from public access. Nobody at the archive could tell her who'd filed it or why. It predated the current staff by decades. She didn't think anything of it at the time, she said. She was starting to think something of it now. Elias looked down at the rows of sealed glass domes still waiting in the dark below them and understood that whatever had been buried on this hillside, somebody had also gone to a great deal of trouble a long time ago to make sure nobody went looking for it twice. 3 mornings running after the rope, Anna found Elias already at the fence line when she came out to check the garden beds, coffee in one hand, the other one holding a length of wire he was using to patch the gate latch that had been loose since before she started volunteering there. He didn't make anything of it. He just kept working while she watered, and she kept watering while he worked, and neither of them said much beyond good morning and a question about whether the tomatoes had taken the frost badly. It wasn't anything. She told herself that plainly, the way she told herself most things now. It was 2 people standing on either side of the same fence, doing separate jobs at the same hour, 3 days running. She was still telling herself that when Evelyn's car started showing up before hers did. Evelyn returned that evening with a banker's box of county archive material. She'd talked someone into releasing early, and by the time Elias had the work light running off the truck battery, they were both on their knees on the tarp beside the open hatch, going through paper that hadn't been touched since before either of them was born. Most of it was nothing. Tax ledgers, water rights filings, the kind of municipal paperwork that existed to be forgotten. Then Evelyn stopped on a page and went quiet the way she had at the drainage channel, and Elias leaned in close enough to read it over her shoulder, close enough that the work light threw both their shadows against the same section of tarp. Neither of them noticed the car that slowed on the county road behind them, or the man's inside it, who rolled down his window and took 2 photographs before driving on. The article ran 3 days later in the Cedar County Courier, a short human interest piece about the mystery structure out on Route 11, built around a quote from the Preservation Office and a photograph of Elias and Evelyn bent over the same document, their heads close together under the work light. The caption didn't say anything untrue. It didn't need to. Local history enthusiasts team up to uncover Victorian era, find it, read, and left the rest to the picture. Anna saw it on the counter at the feed store, folded open to that page by someone who'd already read it and left it there for the next person. She didn't buy a copy. She read it, standing at the counter, put it back exactly where she'd found it, and drove home and telling herself it was nothing. A photograph, a caption. People in this county turned less into more all the time, and she'd lived here long enough to know better than to let a folded newspaper decide anything for her. She told herself that the whole drive home, and she still opened the kitchen drawer when she got there. The application had been sitting in that drawer for 4 months, filled out in her own handwriting, addressed and stamped and never mailed. A teaching position at a 2-room schoolhouse in Cedar Hollow, 40 miles north, the kind of posting most people her age spent a career trying to transfer away from. She'd wanted it since before she knew what wanting something cost. She'd kept not sending it for reasons she'd stopped examining too closely somewhere around month 2. She sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in front of her for a long time. This had nothing to do with the newspaper. She made herself believe that first because it needed to be true before anything else could be. She'd wanted this job before she'd ever met Elias, before she'd ever held a rope over a hole in the ground for a man who thanked her like it could cost him something to be thanked. The photograph hadn't changed what she wanted. It had only reminded her of something she'd been letting herself forget on purpose, which was that wanting things quietly and waiting to see if anyone noticed had never once in her life gotten her the thing she wanted. She drove to the lot the next morning before her shift, the way she'd told him she would after the first night with the rope. Elias and Evelyn were already there, heads bent over the same box of records in the morning light, Evelyn saying something that made him almost smile, an expression Anna had only seen him wear once before, over a rope and a hole in the ground, and it had been aimed at her. She didn't get out of the car. She sat at the edge of the lot for a full minute, watching 2 people who understood the same language do the work she couldn't have helped with, even if she'd tried. And then she put the car back in gear and drove to the post office instead of the garden gate. She mailed the envelope before she could talk herself out of it a second time. I'm done being the one who finds out last. The journal was the first thing that made sense of anything. Evelyn found it near the bottom of the box, bound in leather, gone soft and dark at the corners. The pages inside thick enough to have survived a century better than the tax ledgers stacked around it. The handwriting belonged to a woman named Josephine Hart, and the first entry Evelyn read aloud was dated 1890, the same year, give or take, that the manganese in the glass would have started its slow drift toward purple. Josephine Hart had been a botanist. The journal made that much clear in its first page, in the careful Latin genus names filling the margins, in the sketches of root structures done with a hand that had drawn them 100 times before and still bothered to get them right. What took longer to understand, reading further, was why a botanist with that much skill had never once had her name attached to anything the Royal Society kept a record of. The journal explained that too, eventually in language Josephine Hart had clearly not expected anyone else to read. She'd been turned away from every scientific body she'd applied to, not for lack of results, but for lack of a name the society considered credible coming out of a woman's mouth. She'd found a patron instead, a man with money and land and no interest in botany beyond what it could be sold for, and she'd built this chamber with his backing, because it was the only way anyone would let her keep working at all. Patron's name was written on nearly every page for the first 2 years. Then it stopped appearing, and what replaced it was shorter, angrier, and careful in a different way, the careful of someone who'd started writing things down because she suspected she might need proof later. Tucked behind the journal's last page, held flat by the leather binding itself, was a folded copy of the 1890 land patent, the deed that had signed this hillside and everything built on it over to the patron alone. A witness had notarized it, not Josephine, a man whose name meant nothing to Elias, whose signature ran in the same tight, deliberate loops as every other document the patron himself had ever put his hand to. Elias asked whose name that was at the bottom, next to the patron's. Evelyn turned the deed toward the work light so he could read it himself, and he was already reaching for something in the truck bed before she finished saying it out loud. He came back with a manila folder he hadn't opened in 3 years because he hadn't needed to, because he'd had every line of it memorized since the week it ended his career. He laid the folder open next to the deed on the tarp, a forged signature on a falsified environmental report. The one his own lawyer had spent 8 months failing to prove wasn't his, notarized by a name he'd never once thought to question. He set his finger on the loop of the capital letter first, then the crossbar, then the particular downward stroke at the end of the name that didn't match how anyone alive today had been taught to write it. Same hand. Not the same document, not the same century, but the same deliberate, practiced forgery done by someone who'd clearly had a great deal of prior experience, making one signature look like another. Evelyn asked whose patent that was at the top of the 1890 deed. Elias didn't answer right away. He was doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish, counting backward from a name on his own ruined career to a name on a land deed 130 years older than he was, and landing, both times, on the same family. This isn't the first time, was as far as Elias got that night. Evelyn wanted to call someone. He talked her out of it, told her they needed more than a hunch and a handwriting match before they went to anyone official, and spent the rest of the week proving himself right about that, one phone call at a time. The hearing to formalize the preservation claim was 11 days out. He needed a local witness willing to speak to the chamber's value in front of the county board, someone the community would trust more than a stranger from the Historic Preservation Office. He had a list of 4 names. By the end of the week, he had a list of 4 names crossed out. The first call was easy to make and short to end. The hardware store owner who'd sold him lumber back when the goats still had a paying contract said he'd be glad to write a letter of support, then called back 2 days later to say his supplier contract had come up for renewal sooner than expected, and it wasn't the right time. And he was sorry. He really was. The second call took longer to place and shorter to hear the end of. A former colleague from Elias's old firm, someone who'd stayed quiet during the scandal 3 years back but never once believed the official story, agreed on the phone to testify as an expert witness on the chamber's engineering. He called back the next morning. His firm had just been awarded a contract with a subsidiary of Callahan Development. Unrelated, he said. completely unrelated, and his lawyer had advised him not to take on anything that might look like a conflict. Elias didn't argue with either of them. There wasn't anything to argue. Both men had families, mortgages, employees who depended on them staying employed, and neither of them owed Elias anything close to what it would cost them to say yes. The third name on the list didn't answer at all. 3 calls over 2 days, no callback. The fourth name answered on the first ring and told him, before Elias had finished explaining why he was calling, that a courier had dropped off a letter from a law firm that morning, addressed to her personally, reminding her that certain zoning variances her business depended on were still pending county approval, and that the county board reviewing those variances was the same board Elias wanted her to stand in front of and contradict. Nobody used the word threat. Nobody had to. By the 5th day, Elias stopped making calls and started sitting with the folder instead, the one that had sat in his truck for 3 years without being opened, now spread across the kitchen table next to the copy of the 1890 deed. Between the two of them, there was enough to end more than a zoning dispute, enough to unravel a signature on a report that had cost him his license, and enough, if it went far enough, to reach every contract Callahan Development had ever notarized using the same firm, the same forged hand, going back 3 generations. He knew what he was holding. He hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Evelyn drove out that evening with takeout. Neither of them ate and sat across the table from him, while he laid the pages out one more time, side by side, the pattern of the forgery visible now in a way it hadn't been the first night he'd found it. She asked if he was going to use it. Elias looked at the deed, at the folder, at the phone on the table that hadn't rung all day. He didn't answer. Elias didn't answer Evelyn that night, and he didn't sleep either. He sat at the kitchen table until the coffee went cold and the folder stopped looking like evidence and started looking like a weapon, which was a different thing entirely, and he knew the differences because he'd spent 3 years on the wrong end of one. He got as far as finding a reporter's number before he stopped. He'd built the whole plan out in his head by then. Every page copied, every forged signature laid out side by side across 3 generations, delivered to the one journalist in the county who still did the kind of digging that made people uncomfortable. It would end Callahan Development inside a year. It would end the family's name in this county the way his own name had nearly ended 3 years ago. And there was a version of him, tired enough and angry enough, that wanted exactly that. He opened the journal instead of dialing. He'd read the last entries twice already, but he read them again, slower this time, past the part where Josephine Hart described everything Augustus Callahan had taken from her, past the part where she named him outright for the first time in 130 years, to the very last page, where the handwriting steadied out like she'd taken a long breath before writing it. She'd had her own version of the reporter's number, a colleague at a paper willing to print anything she gave him. She'd written down why she never called him, in a hand that didn't shake even once across the whole sentence, and Elias sat with those words longer than he'd sat with anything in 3 years. He closed the journal. He put the reporter's number away. He drove to the Callahan Development offices the next evening alone after the last car had left the lot, and waited by his truck until Victor came out and saw him standing there and didn't look surprised. Neither of them raised their voice. That was the strangest part of it afterward, thinking back. Elias laid the folder on the hood of Victor's car, open to the page that mattered, the deed and the forged report side by side under the parking lot lights, and let Victor read it in silence for as long as he needed to. Victor's hand found the edge of the hood at some point during that silence and stayed there. Elias told him what he wasn't going to do first, because it seemed to matter more than what he was going to do. He wasn't calling the reporter. He wasn't filing a complaint with the State Bar against whatever firm had notarized both documents. He wasn't taking this to anyone who could turn it into the kind of story that ended careers and companies, and, eventually, people. Then he told him what he wanted instead. The stop-work order withdrawn permanently, not for 48 hours, but for good, with the parcel donated outright to a conservation trust Evelyn could help him set up within the month. Full funding for the chamber's restoration. Structural work first, public access second, at Callahan Development's expense, attributed publicly to no one, and one name cleared in whatever way the historical records still allowed 130 years later. Josephine Hart's name on the patent that had always belonged to her. Victor asked quietly if Elias understood what he was giving up. The folder in front of him was worth more than the land. It was worth more than one hillside's worth of glass and iron. It could reach back through 3 generations of contracts and undo half of what his family had built. Elias said he understood exactly what he was giving up, and that was the point. Victor stood there a long time, one hand still flat on the hood of his own car, looking at a piece of paper that could end everything he'd inherited, offered back to him by the one man who had every reason on earth not to hand it over quietly. He signed it 2 days later. No press conference, no public statement, just a lawyer's letter confirming the parcel transfer and a wired payment to a restoration account Evelyn had opened that week. Elias never heard him say he was wrong about any of it. Not once. Not in writing and not out loud. And some part of him had known from the parking lot that he never would. Victor found him at the gate the morning. The crew came to remove the excavator for good and stopped just long enough to say the only thing he ever said about the whole arrangement. Callahans always win, just not always the way people expect. He got in his truck and drove away for the last time, and Elias stood at the gate a long while after the dust settled, holding a signed release in one hand and the copper tag from his shirt pocket in the other, and understood that he'd just won something, too, even if it wasn't the kind that came with anyone standing around to watch. The private settlement stayed private. That had been the whole point of it. Elias understood that, but it left the county board with a different problem entirely. One Victor's signature on a lawyer's letter couldn't solve by itself. A parcel didn't become a permanent historic site because 2 men shook hands in an empty parking lot. It became one because a public board voted on it, in a public room, with public testimony on the record, and nobody outside that room knew the fight was already over, which meant nobody in Cedar County had any reason yet to stop being afraid. The hearing room held maybe 40 folding chairs, and most of them sat empty. Evelyn presented the chamber's engineering findings first. The manganese glass, the drainage channel, the century of deliberate construction nobody could argue was anything but historically significant. The board listened, nodded in the right places, and then the chairman asked, the way procedure required her to ask, whether anyone present wished to speak to the parcel's value to the surrounding community. Nobody moved. The silence went on long enough that the clerk's pen stopped scratching against the sign-in sheet, long enough for the wall clock to mark off most of a full minute, long enough for Elias to understand that 3 years of watching his own name get quietly erased from a professional community hadn't prepared him for watching it happen to someone else's name instead. 130 years late, and about to happen all over again for lack of one person willing to stand up in a room and say it mattered. He hadn't told anyone about the private deal. He'd promised Victor he wouldn't, and a promise made to end a fight was still a promise, even to a man he had no reason to trust, which meant every person in that room still believed Callahan Development could roll an excavator over this hillside the moment the hearing ended, and every person in that room had a mortgage, a contract, a nephew working construction, something the Callahan name could still reach if they said the wrong thing out loud. Chairman said she'd give it one more moment before moving to a vote. Anna stood up from the back row. Elias hadn't seen her come in. He hadn't seen her at all since the morning her car stopped showing up at the fence line. 3 weeks now, long enough that he'd stopped letting himself wonder about it out loud. She walked to the small podium the way she did most things, without hurry, and didn't look at him once on the way there. She said her name, and that she managed the community garden plots bordering the parcel in question, and that she wasn't a historian and wasn't going to pretend to understand what the glass in that hillside was worth to anyone else. What she could speak to was smaller than that. She'd watched one man clear 30 goats' worth of bramble off land. Everyone else in this county had already written off by hand alone for weeks before anyone else showed up to help him do it. She'd watched the ground underneath that bramble turn out to hold something the whole county would have lost without ever knowing it existed. She said she didn't think a place like that got saved by accident. She thought it got saved because somebody refused to walk past it, and she was standing up today because she'd decided somewhere in the last 3 weeks that she was done being somebody who walked past things too. She sat back down without waiting for a response. Chairman called the vote 20 minutes later. It passed, unanimous. The parcel designated permanently, the trust transfer approved without objection from anyone in the room, because nobody in the room had a reason to object once. One voice had gone on record willing to be counted. Elias found Anna in the hallway afterward, coat already on, keys already in her hand. He asked when she'd started managing the garden plots alone, and she told him it wasn't the garden she wanted to talk about. Told him about Cedar Hollow, the 2-room schoolhouse 40 miles north, the application she'd mailed 3 weeks ago from the parking lot outside this very building. The offer had come back faster than she'd expected. She was due there in 6 days. Elias stood in the hallway with the words, landing somewhere he hadn't braced for. 6 days, he said, because it was the only thing he could find to say that wasn't going to come out wrong. She nodded once, and didn't wait for anything else, and walked out to her car in the gray afternoon light while he stood there working out, too slowly that he'd just spent 3 weeks letting a silence sit between them that he'd never once meant to leave that long. Evelyn came by the lot 2 days after the hearing, not to work, just to say what she'd apparently already decided somewhere in that hallway without telling anyone. A national conservation office back east had been trying to recruit her for a year. She'd turned it down twice. She wasn't turning it down a third time. She told Elias she'd spent the better part of a month convincing herself this hillside was the reason to stay, and it had taken watching him choose a school teacher over a settlement check to understand she'd been building a life out of the wrong kind of evidence. She wasn't angry about it. She said it the way she said most things, precise, a little amused at her own blind spot, and she shook his hand instead of anything more complicated. and told him to send her photographs once the restoration crew finished the roofline. She was gone within the week. She didn't ask him to explain anything, and he didn't owe her an explanation he hadn't fully worked out himself yet. He had 3 days left after that, and he spent the first 2 of them doing nothing about it at all, telling himself a decision made in a hallway under pressure wasn't the same as a decision made with a clear head, and a clear head took time he wasn't sure he still had. On the 4th day, he drove out to the schoolhouse site himself, 40 miles north, and found the 2-room building Anna would be teaching in come fall, still boarded up for the summer, a garden plot out back gone to weeds the same way this hillside once had. He stood there a long time before he understood what he'd actually driven up here to look at. Came back with a plan instead of a speech, because that was the only language he'd ever been any good at. He found her on the 6th day, packing the last of the car, and told her he'd spoken to the school board about donating a portion of the seed stock to the schoolhouse garden, cuttings from the restored chamber, enough to start a growing program for whatever students wanted to learn it. He told her he'd need somewhere nearby to keep the herd while the program got established, and Cedar Hollow had more open pasture than this county ever had. He wasn't asking her to stay. He made sure she understood that. He was asking if there was room for one more thing in the life she was about to start, on her terms, at her pace, built around a work he already knew how to do with his hands. She didn't answer right away. She looked at him the way she had that first night on the rope, unhurried, weighing something before she committed to holding it. Bring the goats. He drove up 2 weeks later with the herd in a borrowed trailer and a box of copper tags in the passenger seat, one for every seedling that would eventually go into the new garden, each one stamped by hand with whatever name the plant deserved. The restoration crew finished the chamber roof that same autumn. The purple glass stayed exactly the color it had settled into, and stayed there, no longer buried, no longer hidden from the sun that had taken a century to change it. A small brass plaque went up near the entrance, funded anonymously through the Conservation Trust, crediting Josephine Hart as the botanist who designed and built the chamber in 1890, the first public record of her name attached to the work in 130 years. Elias kept the copper tag from that first afternoon. He didn't put it on display with the others. He kept it in a drawer at the house he shared with Anna and the goats, next to a photograph of Claire in her old university greenhouse. And some mornings he took it out and turned it over in his hand before he went out to check on the herd, not because he needed reminding, but because some things are worth holding on purpose. The seeds took root the following spring. 60 years of dormancy broke in a single growing season, the way it always does once something finally gets given ground to reach for again. Elias never told anyone what he'd walked away from the night he stood in that parking lot with a folder that could have ended a company and a family both. He didn't need anyone to know. Some debts get settled loud, in courtrooms and headlines, and some get settled quiet. In a hillside, nobody drives past anymore without looking twice. You can bury history under 100 years of thorn and rusted iron. You can bury a person's name under someone else's signature for just as long. But given enough seasons and enough people willing to keep digging past the point where it stopped making sense to, both of them find their way back into the light. That was Elias and Anna's hillside. Everyone carries a version of their own. Maybe it's a piece of your own history somebody else tried to erase, and you're still deciding whether to dig it back up or leave it buried where it's safer. Or maybe it's the opposite, a chance to walk away clean and build something new instead of settling a score for you'd finally earned the right to settle. Tell me which one you're carrying. I read every comment.